Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. It is I, once again, producer JL, coming at you with another solo episode. Rob, Dave, and the rest of the crew are out for the summer. Hopefully, we'll get them back on as soon as we possibly can. But for the time being, you're stuck with me. No, I'm only kidding, obviously. But obviously, the summer is, like I've mentioned before on many previous occasions of this solo venture that I've done this summer so far, this regular season was so emotionally taxing, with such high expectations, for the team itself, and obviously with the interactions on social media and it being really draining on a lot of us, myself included, along with the rest of the crew, and obviously we have our lives in the summer as a time to kind of get away from it all. A lot of the crew decided to just kind of take it easy for the summer, in certain ways. And, especially Rob, Rob is the heart of this podcast. He's the one who started this all. And, I'm thankful to him, to Becky, Dave, and the rest of the crew for, allowing me to, shepherd this ship, while there's really nothing much going on. Obviously, we covered some news. Haven't really gone too much in the draft picks as of yet. Maybe we'll probably get an episode of just featuring some of those players soon enough. But for the time being, a lot of this is really just recapping some of the small news that has gone on in the NHL and also with the New York Rangers, but also just kind of having some retrospectives as well. And that's what leads me into the topic of today's episode. So I was having a conversation with a couple of people that I know in a group chat. And, I had the thought about Joe Sakic essentially not becoming a New York Ranger, all because of a movie. Obviously, you've seen the documentary. Those who lived it knew what happened. The Rangers put an offer sheet out to Joe Sakic. He signed it, and the Avalanche matched it. Plain and simple. And the funds from the movie were able to be used to bring the money that the Rangers were going to give to Sakic. And that allowed him to stay in Colorado and basically kind of change the trajectory of a lot of what happened to the NHL back in the day. But a lot of that tends to make you think, what if? You think like, what would happen if this had happened? Or what would happen if that happened? What would happen if the Rangers had picked Elias Pettersson in the draft in 2017 instead of Lias Andersson? Or what would happen if Pavel Bure had come to the New York Rangers while Wayne Gretzky was still on the club? Those are things to think about, and definitely something I'll look to explore, within the next couple of weeks or so. But for right now, touching on the Sakic topic a little bit, this one is somewhat related. So the reason why the Rangers went after Joe Sakic was because of Mark Messier essentially wanting to leave and go to Vancouver. So the Rangers wanted to kind of replace him with somebody who was of equal caliber or probably even better at the time. Now, this isn't going to be a sit here and bash Mark Messier for an hour or less. I'm not sitting here and I'm not going to say Mess was a problem. Mess was the worst thing to happen to this franchise after they won the Cup. But there is a discussion to be made that a lot of what the Rangers did really kind of was done to, and rightly so. I can't blame Neil Smith for doing it and the rest of the Rangers group, for trying to cater to Messier. But at the same time, I think they were, I think the pressure of 94 really did this franchise a disservice. Now, obviously, Messier and Neil Smith get a huge ton of credit for giving this franchise their first Stanley Cup in so many years. I was only one at the time, so I never could really. I didn't know. I just was not aware of it. So all of my years were basically after that. I really only began to really know what hockey was until like the late 90s, early 2000s, when I really began to understand sports. Around the same time I began following the Mets and the Jets, of course. But, you have to give Neil Smith and Mark Messier a ton of credit for ending a 54-year cup drought, you know, and with the not only at the deadline, but also with the moves that they made prior to that, he should get a lot of credit. They really did bolster this team up, and I guess Mike Keenan was right in trying to figure out how this team could play with the right players that they had. But also on that same argument, though, with how they handled that trade deadline and how they ended up doing things going forward, I really think kind of hurt this franchise long term. And it all really began with that 1994 deadline. You know, obviously, people kind of wanted a similar result this year. But it seems like there was more talent to be had for the prices that the Rangers paid back then than what Chris Drury was essentially looking to try and get this time around. I think the only one that really would have warranted a really big trade would have been, Jake Gensel. But the point I'm trying to make is this. While that 94 deadline obviously did the thing that they were supposed to do and win a Stanley Cup, there seems to have been a lot of mistakes because of it and after. Now, I don't want this to come off as, oh, this young kid is trying to make a mess out of things or make a mock. No, that's not what I'm saying. It's just putting things into perspective for, just to kind of go back a little bit. You look at the way the Rangers operated relative to how other teams operated when it came to making trades, adding talent to the team, and supplementing losses with players who can fill it in properly. And obviously, with no salary cap back in the day, the Rangers were free to spend as they could, and they did their level best to try and fill those spots. So the one thing I want to say is, as much as Mark Messier was probably the guy for this franchise, a lot of him being here and what he did kind of was sort of a detriment to this team too. Because I almost am positive that Messier was definitely involved in a lot of moves going forward, especially after Mike Keenan left. Obviously, he has such a big voice. I mean, he's Hall of Fame Stanley Cup winning captain at that time. So why not, trust the opinion of a guy who was a Hall of Famer and probably one of the better players in the league? But at the same time, Messier was beginning to kind of, he wasn't the same guy he was in the early 90s. And even in 94, he was, slowly beginning to fade a little bit. But obviously that happens as you get older, of course. But he was still immensely talented and helped the team out. But I feel as if after they won, well, during the season, obviously you really, a lot of this goes on Mike Keenan too. And I know that Neil Smith didn't want to make some of these trades, but in order to put them over the hump, he did it. First and foremost, let's take a look at essentially, I'm looking at right now just some of the moves that they made in 94. So they made a ton of good moves, and some of these predate 94, but bringing in, Jay Wells, bringing in Esa Tikkanen, bringing in just, well, even on Tikkanen, now that I think about it, I think Tikkanen was traded for Doug Weight, if I'm correct. And, that's, while Tikkanen was a solid contributor for the team, Doug Weight was a very good hockey player, Obviously, I don't have the deep perspective of having been there in the moment. I can only go off of what I've seen, what I've read, and what I've been able to gather from different people. But I really think this team, especially after they won the cup in 94, essentially tried to build the same type of team, but they didn't have the right assets to do it with. And you look at these teams compared to the Detroit Red Wings of the day, the Philadelphia Flyers of the day, the Colorado Avalanche, even the Dallas Stars to a degree. They had a lot of teams that were infused with players of their own. And I don't think the Rangers ever really had that. And I think that's kind of and even look at the New Jersey Devils, for example. The New Jersey Devils, granted they have one less cup than we do, but we're still able to really infuse that team with players of their own. One player would leave, someone else would come in and take that spot. So a lot of this also falls on just the attempt of trying to replicate the magic of 94, but also just really bad scouting and moves, in my opinion. I could be wrong. And again, this isn't a knock, and I'm not going to sit here and defame anyone. This isn't a podcast to, you know, say bad things about somebody or whatever. But I mean, it's just the truth of the fact that they really did a bad job at supplementing the team. Therefore, they had to overspend on their needs. Also, you could even look at the whole Sergei Zubov for Ulf Samuelsson trade. Now, I understand why they did it, because they were quote unquote soft at the time after getting steamrolled by the Flyers in the playoffs, and they felt that they needed to get tougher. But at the same time, you're also getting rid of probably one of the best offensive defensemen in the history of the NHL in Sergei Zubov, for a guy who, yeah, Ulfie was tough, but I mean, you can only rely on Brian Leetch so much on the back end. And I think the Rangers not having a guy like a Zubov on the back end really did a disservice to this team in general. I don't think that's a trade that really needed to be made, honestly. Let me pull it up again just so that I can get it right. But I do know that there were a few trades that went around that essentially kind of really ruined this team's, chances. And, going back to the 94 team, we take a look at who they let go. Obviously, they had gotten Craig McTavish, Glenn Anderson, Stefan Matteau, Brian Noonan, just to bolster the team. And those were decent moves, but at the same time, you give up a guy like Mike Gartner, who was a prolific scorer. You give up a guy like a Tony Amonte, who ended up becoming basically a superstar. And Todd Marchand was a really big contributor in a lot of those late Oilers teams where he had a bunch of speed. And that seems like that was something the Rangers were really lacking, in my opinion, back in the day. Maybe they could have gone without trading for Glenn Anderson. I mean, again, it's hard to really second guess these moves because they ended up doing the thing that you're supposed to do and winning a cup. But at the same time, you look at all these other teams in the 90s that were able to build through their farm, and they were able to have long-term success. I mean, even the Tikkanen for Doug Weight trade. Doug Weight is somebody that the late 90s Rangers could have used heavily. They could have, and even in the early 2000s, that guy could have probably been the next captain of the team when Messier left. And maybe they don't need to get a Joe Sakic kind of guy. So then you kind of get into this whole, do you trade prospects? Because you don't really know what's going to happen. Do you keep them, this and that and the fourth and whatever? But a good franchise is always able to supplement, like what the Rangers are doing right now, essentially, is getting a bunch of guys that you can look at and then trading the ones that you can for assets while not blowing up, the ones that are really good. I can't really see, I'm not entirely sure, and I apologize for this, on where a guy like Doug Weight stood, even a guy like a Tony Amonte. But I know everybody loved Amonte, though, just from the comments that I read when I look through videos and when I, have talked to people about it. Amonte, everybody loved him, and I don't think many people were too happy, even though Matteau, provided one of the greatest moments in Rangers history, and Brian Noonan was a strong contributor. I think a lot of people would have liked to have seen Tony Amonte be a Ranger for an extended period of time, and he was very good for them too as a rookie. So not only do these trades kind of look, the 94 trades are hard to, like I said, are hard to really criticize because they did the thing, but then you can also say that the team mortgaged too much to a degree where it ended up hurting them in the future, and they didn't really draft well, at the end, because they could, they could never really fill it out. It always seemed like they were just trying to buy their way back. And you know, it just I look at it and I think about it because I'm thinking about the Sakic situation and I'm thinking, man, what like how? Well, maybe this is just me, being a bit, wishful thinking. But so the Zubov trade was that's another thing, the shoehorning of Peter Nedved. I know he was a high potential guy and he seemed a bit off, but they traded him for Samuelson and Zubov, or Samuelson and Robitaille, excuse me. So it, you know, maybe they could have found a way to snag Luke Robitaille somehow from Pittsburgh without having to include him. But I guess, that was that was how it was at the time. But it's hard for me to really speak on that too much from not having been there. I was only 2 when this trade happened. And let me just look at Luke Robitaille real quick. I from the footage that I've seen, I really liked what I saw just from the videos that I've seen when Luke Robitaille as a Ranger. It was kind of strange on why they just they traded him for Kevin Stevens. Why? That's the point I'm trying to make too. Is that, yeah, he may have had below average numbers with the Rangers, but I feel like those teams were very put together very haphazardly. And yeah, they still had the core of the 94 team in Graves, Messier, Leach, and Richter. But it just kind of seems like after the 94 team, they didn't have a lot of guys that could really replicate what Jay Wells could bring, or, to an extent what Doug Lidster was able to do, even though Lidster was there in some capacity, or even, Kevin Lowe wasn't the same. I don't know, I'm probably going all over the place with this, but the point I'm trying to make is that with them building around Messier and trying to redo the 94 team, that really did hurt them. And then with Messier leaving, they, okay, so Gretzky comes year 1, the year before Messier leaves. They go to the conference final. So then what they essentially try to do is try to build a 94 team again, but this time with Gretzky as the linchpin, which is fine, even though he was on the downturn of his career. But outside of the missed opportunities of missing on Brendan Shanahan at one point in the past, and also not getting Pavel Bure, you could see that just from looking at the rosters, they essentially tried to build the team like the 94 team. But the problem is that they never could supplement that. And that is, I think, a byproduct of just trying to follow the Messier kind of build. And then to make matters worse, they re-signed Messier at the end of his career, which didn't do anybody any favors either. I think the Rangers should have not brought him back and just tried to rebuild from then on. But then I understand, being a New York fan, and with, James Dolan with all his money you want to spend. And look, they could have pulled it off if they had just drafted better, or if they at least kept some of the players that they could have traded away. Like, well, what was I? Let me see. Let me look this up again. But one of the players that when I found out that he was a Ranger, I was blown away when I found this out, that Matthias Nordstrom was just traded away. Matthias Nordstrom was probably one of the better players, at least, I'm not saying that he was this, Hall of Fame kind of player, but the guy was very good for a very long time. And he was traded, I'm looking at this here, he was traded with Nathan Lafayette, Ian LaPerriere, and Ray Ferraro. Oh my goodness. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. I have to kind of pull these things together because I know when these things happen, but I just want to make sure that I get it right. He was traded with Nathan Lafayette, Ian LaPerriere, and Ray Ferraro to the Kings for Marty McSorley, Yari Curry, and Shane Churla. Oh, that's but see trades like that, instead of just leaving those guys there. Yeah, I'm sure Ian LaPerriere, he could have been a decent fourth liner. Nathan Lafayette, do what you will with him. But Ray Ferraro was no slouch. And Matthias Nordstrom, the talent was there clearly because LA cultivated it. So you could have put him next to Brian Leach, for goodness sake, and kind of, eased in Jeff Bukaboom in another part of the lineup at some point. Another 94 left over too. But they make dumb trades like that. I think this is a dumb trade. Honestly, I think it was a dumb trade. And I think losing players like that really hurt this team moving forward. And then they obviously, had to make up for it somehow, because as good as those teams in the late 90s and early 2000s knew how to score reasonably well with all that high-powered offensive talent, that defense was just absolutely atrocious. And Brian Leach not getting any younger didn't exactly do anybody any favors. And then you bring a guy like Mark Messier back in, and then they try to still build the team the same way they did in 94, but they didn't have the right assets for it. It was always too much, but too short. And so basically the point I'm trying to make is this. I know it sounds like I'm rambling, but as much as the 94 trade deadline and a lot of the, sort of suspect drafting that they had in the late 90s and early 2000s, hold on, let me backtrack for a second because I lost my train of thought there. They did a terrible job in not supplementing what they lost after 94, because I can sit here and say losing Mike Gartner was huge, losing Tony Amonte was huge, but then you also have to say, well, John Luke, it ended up winning them the cup, which is fair and it's absolutely valid. So it's hard to really say, hey, you can look back on it, but then you just think a little bit, would they have been able to win the cup without having traded those guys? I mean, you'll never know. Clearly, Mike Keenan didn't think so. Clearly, Neil Smith was bold enough to do the trades that his coach wanted, so he was also part of it as well. But then you look at the track record afterwards, and it just kind of seems like they just missed on a lot. Before we end this one, and I'm sorry if this really comes off as just rambling. This is just kind of a thought that I had. We're going to take a look at the Rangers draft history. And it's not to say that, they couldn't. And also, I just think they made dumb moves too, truth be told. Like I said, when I found out Matthias Nordstrom was a Ranger, and because I always remembered him as a King, when I really started focusing into hockey towards the end of his career, I just remember seeing him as essentially a Los Angeles King. I'm like, wow, this guy's good. Obviously, it also helped that you play with Rob Blake, So you take a look at. I'm scrolling down towards. All right, so let's look at 1990. So this is when it really starts. So it seems like they drafted very well at the beginning, because Jason Weinrich, I'm going to assume that's the same guy that I'm thinking of. He ended up, I think, is this the Weinrich? No, this is a different Weinrich. Okay. There's a Weinrich that played for the Blackhawks that I thought was, good. But you take a look at, let's start with the 1990 draft. So they had a bunch of picks this draft, and they were able to sniff out Sergei Nemchinov, Sergei Zubov, and Doug Weight. Okay. In 91, they got Alexei Kovalev, and that's Corey Hirsch. Okay, so he wasn't, he was a serviceable NHL player. 92, Matthias Nordstrom, Eric Cairns. Eric Cairns, pretty big dude. Was somebody that probably could have been, a good option down on the fourth line outside of his time period with the Rangers. Ended up becoming a famous Islander, and he's more associated with that. Vladimir Vorobiev, I'm not going to mention that, even though he did have a good first game with the Rangers in his debut. Then you at 93, you had Matthias Nordstrom, Todd Marchand. Those are two that were, stood out the most. And then 94, the year that they won the Cup, you had Eric Bolton. Wow, I didn't even realize if this is the same Eric Bolton I'm thinking of, probably not. Oh, it is the same Eric Bolton that I'm thinking of. Okay, he never played for the Rangers. Not that he would have had an impact, but I'm just pointing out notable names that I remember. Now the page reset. Okay, so you had Eric Bolton, You had Kim Janssen. Then also in 94, you had Dan Kluche. Okay. Then 95, Christian Dubé, Mark Savard, Dale Purinton. Well, that's an unfortunate story in its own right. But Mark Savard, Christian Dubé, okay, guys who played for the team at one point. Then you had in 96 Daniel Gano. He played some time with the Rangers, but really, Jeff Brown, maybe. Let me just take a look at this. Did he play for the Rangers? He did not. That name. I feel like Jeff Brown is a very generic Canadian name. Let's see. So we go 97. So total whiff on that first round pick. Mike York. Okay, that turned out to be decent. Mike Motto turned out to be a good player. Johan Holmquist was also a somewhat decent player. And then 98, obviously Manny Malhotra, Jason LaBarbera, Tomasz Kluchek. So there are some players here that became decent NHLers, but they either traded them away or the rest of the guys that they picked weren't that great. 99, they had 2 first-round picks. I think, 2 first-round picks, and they picked Pavel Brendel and Jamie Lundmark. Okay. So the reason why I'm saying this is beginning to add to a lot of what was going on and the problems that this team faced back in the day. There were some decent names here, but there was only like maybe 1 or 2 that would really stand out the most. I mean, Manny Malhotra, I'm not saying he was some kind of goal scorer, but I feel like if they had just treated him or at least kind of cultivated him a little bit more, he would have been good. Same thing with Mark Savard. I understand that he probably wasn't as, prolific as he was, and maybe the trade is what maybe did that to him, but you never really know unless they really find a way to cultivate this talent. But there really, up until maybe 2000, there really wasn't much that this team could really look at. Obviously, you go to 2000, Dominic Moore, obviously Henrik Lundqvist, of course. Then 2001, Dan Black. Now, this is when it starts to get a little bit better. It seems like the shift changed around the time Garth Sather. Glenn Sather left, and not Glenn Sather. Glenn Sather came in, and Neil Smith left. Because now there's some names here that are actually notable players. Granted, whether some of them played long-term for the Rangers or not, that's beside the point. Well, because I'm really talking about Neil Smith, but Marit Ziglicki, Ryan Holweg, Dan Blackburn, Fedor Tutin, Garth Murray, Let me look at Garth Murray real quick if I'm thinking of the same guy. Okay, well, my computer's acting dumb right now, but you get what I'm saying, Garth Murray. Okay, so he was kind of a fringe NHL player, but that name sticks out to me for some reason. But yeah, Dan Blackburn, Fedor Tutin, Marek Zidlicki, Ryan Holweg. Then we go to 2002, Peter Pruka. There you go. But anyways, the point that I'm trying to make is that if you look at a lot of the drafts from 1990 to 1998, 99, the Rangers really missed on a lot of players. And there was certainly a dearth of talent that they could have looked at. And then they tried to fill it up with, players that, with money that they tried to fix it, but they really couldn't. And if I'm a little off base here, I apologize. I'm just trying to, with some of the research that I put together, I just want to make sure that I kind of make my point properly. But the point I'm trying to make is this. The team, even though those, again, I'm not trying to criticize the 94 trades too much because that's what really bolstered this team into, winning the damn thing. But there was this inability to not fill in the gaps on that talent that was missed. And then also trying to cater to Messier, especially his second term, trying to rebuild the same team in 94 all the way through the late 90s, and essentially having this very static way of building and really setting this team back, for years. And obviously with them missing the playoffs after 97 up until 2006, you can see it. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. And Mark Messier did not help at all. When you bring a guy like Mark Messier into the fold, you want to win now. And of course, that's understandable. You bring in a guy like Messier, you bring in a guy like Gretzky, And to a degree, when they brought in Gretzky, I understand. And it worked for a year. But he leaves. You try to essentially fill that in the aggregate, but it doesn't work. Because what was the one thing that this Rangers team in 94 had was homegrown talent. And you needed to supplement the older guys with some younger guys, and they just didn't do it. And then some of the younger guys they brought in just either didn't do well or they traded them away. So, and then we could talk about, just Messier coming back at the second term and just them trying to basically throw all this money. Look, listen, as much as I like it when a team spends money, I was one of the very, very few that actually didn't mind seeing the New York Yankees spend all that money, because that's essentially what I wanted the Mets to do. So seeing that if you had the money to spend it right. Obviously now there's a salary cap, but back then there wasn't. I mean, the Detroit Red Wings were the poster children of spending money and doing it the right way, because they got the right players for all that money and ended up winning a cup in 2002. Granted, it was a bit unsustainable, but they were still able to make the playoffs all those years because they drafted very well, and those draft picks stood around and they were supporting roles, and the Rangers could not do that. And it's a damn shame, because you see teams like the Islanders and the Devils at the time really taking charge with guys that they put together on their own, but also just kind of building through, the right pieces and spending the money that they need. And the same thing with the Devils too, even though they had a slightly different philosophy in spending money. But again, homegrown talent and bringing in who you need to bring in to help supplement the rest of the team. Colorado Avalanche, same thing. Detroit Red Wings, same thing. So my point is this, and again, I apologize if I sound like I'm rambling incessantly, but I was just thinking back at how ridiculous a lot of the things that the Rangers did back in the day were. I try to transport myself into that time period because I was more aware of the Mets than anything, but I try to take that, read what I can find, talk to people about it. And even when I have that somewhat perspective in my head, I still think a lot of it was dumb. And I'm sure there were people at the time who thought a lot of that was crazy. Because like I said, I know a lot of people really did like Tony Amonte. And from the footage that I got to see, because there's a lot of 94, 93 footage online, and obviously seeing him play for the Blackhawks and, later in his career, he would have been perfect for those late 90s Rangers. One of the things that when I really began to start watching hockey was they used to give those classic series on the NHL network, where it was essentially a summary of the series. I don't know why they don't show those anymore, because I think those are great. But I used to sit there hours on end during the summer when I finally got NHL Network and basically begin to, just watch that. And you looked at the way a lot of those teams are built, and you always think, oh, how come, after 97, the Rangers were never around? And then I did my research this and really, delved into a lot of what, went wrong. And then you look at the way like those teams are built, and it's like, well, why couldn't the Rangers do that? Why couldn't they? So, and then the whole thing, and then, and again, I'm not trying to lambast Mark Messier here, but, and then, him coming back, the older I get, the more I see how dumb that was. I understand why they did it though, because the team didn't have anybody of note for a certain period of time towards the end of the 90s, and you wanted to make a splash, you bring back the captain. Sure. But I think they should have had somebody who was, because I from what I'm able to read and from a lot of the research that I've done, it just kind of seemed very laissez-faire. Everyone was just kind of doing their own thing. And who is going to step up to Mark Messier? You need kind of a coach that is willing to kind of like a Mike Keenan, which they obviously wasn't going to rehire him back, especially after what he did in 94, after 94. But that team needed a guy who could have really set everything in line, similar to what Keenan did. They did have John Tortorella towards the end of the 90s. He was an assistant coach that ended up taking over after they fired the head coach. Wonder why they couldn't have brought him in. Maybe things would have been a bit different if Tortorella had been in charge early on. Obviously, we saw the type of coach that Tortorella ended up becoming when he was with the Rangers in 2009. So maybe things would have been a bit different. Who knows? You can sit here and say a bunch of what ifs. But the point I'm trying to make is that just looking back on a lot of what they did, it just kind of really makes you think. And then it kind of turns into looking at nowadays. And not just the Rangers, but teams in general, unless they know that they're there, like the Florida Panthers and a couple other teams in at the deadline. The teams are very reluctant to trade prospects these days, unless they know the deal is certain. You know, you can sit here and say, "Oh, well, the Washington Capitals traded Philip Forsberg for Martin Erad because they thought they were closer than they thought." But then that trade in itself is probably one of the reasons why teams are so hesitant to do it in the first place. I mean, Philip Forsberg for Martin Erad. Look, I knew Martin Erad was a good player. Martin Erad was no scratch. The guy was clearly talented. But I mean, Philip Forsberg was one of the top prospects in the draft that year, or when they drafted him. And even then, everyone was like, well, what are they doing? So I feel like a lot of teams are very hesitant. They seemed a bit more trigger happy back in the day. Obviously, things have changed these days in scouting and evaluations and analytics. So you get a better feel of what you can get. And there's probably a lot of players back in the day that didn't get their due because of the kind of outdated way that they would get scouted. Obviously you have to do the eye test. They have to clearly be, they have to have the it factor, but also maybe there were some things analytically you could find in a player that probably would have done well, and probably some of those good teams that either won multiple Stanley Cups or in the playoffs a lot in the 90s and early 2000s probably had some form of analytics at some point, because the analytics wasn't exactly a foreign concept. It just wasn't mainstream. Teams always have numbers on players and things like that. So it just kind of makes you think like, what were the Rangers doing? What was their thought process? And I'm sure, and I could probably, if I really wanted to, could probably find a way to reach out to Neil Smith and ask him these questions, or maybe he's answered them in somewhere that I have not found yet. And if that is out there, I would like to hear it. So if anyone hears this and knows, of a clip or an interview that Neil Smith kind of talks about this kind of thing a little bit, or if Neil Smith even wants to come on the podcast, this is an open invitation to Neil Smith. I'm not going to sit here and yell at the guy because that's, it's not what I'm trying to do, but I'm just very curious as to what was the thought process of a lot of those moves and some of those draft picks, kind of go a little bit more in depth. Maybe I haven't looked hard enough. I just can't really seem to find much. But I would be very curious to kind of figure that out. Because now you look at the teams now, and obviously you don't want to trade Gabe Perreault. Because clearly this kid is a dynamo. Brandon Othman still has a lot of potential. Brett Berard. Those are the three big guys that are close to being, contributors for this team in the short term. And if you trade them away for pieces that are going to go away in a year or two, and I guess I'll say one last point. I'm thinking of the Riley Smith trade, and they only traded 2 draft picks for him. But maybe back in the day, that type of deal for that type of player might have cost you a prospect or 2. But now with everything being so analytical, you can get a guy like that for a lesser price. And right now, the Rangers don't need as many draft picks as they do because they're infused with elite talent, So it was just interesting looking at the parallels and just thinking about this thing as a whole on the Rangers then and the Rangers now, and what could have been. Maybe the Rangers would have been better with a team of Doug Weight, with Tony Amonte, even with Todd Marchand. Throw them together. Maybe Sergei Zubov doesn't get traded. Maybe they keep Peter Nedved. Maybe they end up trading Peter Nedved. Maybe Kovalev doesn't get dealt and he stays a Ranger for a very long time. Maybe they don't go out and have to re-sign Mark Messier. Maybe they're actually able to get a Brendan Shanahan or a Joe Sakic. Who knows? But it's just an interesting thought. But anyways, that's pretty much it. I didn't realize I could sit here and ramble on for 40 something minutes. But it's just something that I thought, and again, I apologize in advance if I sound like I was kind of rambling on. It's just I had a thought and I wanted to kind of explore it a little bit. Maybe this will be something I'll bring up with, the crew once we return back to normal, once training camp starts. So with that being said, if you were here at this point of the podcast and you've made it all the way through, thank you. Thank you for listening to my incessant rambling about previous Ranger teams. But if you made it here, it also seems like you might be a reader of the blog. Even if you didn't make it to this point, I'm sure you are. But even so, thank you for listening. Thank you for reading our pieces and continue to support us. Dave does a very good job at keeping the website fresh, and he has a lot of thoughts. And I'm glad to be a part of this crew here. So, with that being said, thank you all for taking the chance to listen. And we'll be back in the week with another episode live from the Blue Seats. What am I going to talk about? Well, that's going to be between me from now until after my vacation ends next week. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, morning, evening, whenever you're listening to this. Continue to listen to our podcast. Check out some old episodes for some funny things that we've done in our banter. And also continue to read the blog and check us out as we continue to put out good pieces out during the summer. Anyways, see you guys next week, and let's go Rangers.